The afternoon I stood up in that overheated town hall and said the word, "No," into a room full of men who had known me since I was a boy. I could feel my future thinning like paper in a fire. You have to understand what kind of place it was back then. Central California, late 60s. A farming town that barely made it onto the map, tucked between fields that ran flat and stubborn to the horizon. In summer the dust rose in soft clouds behind tractor tires and hung in the air like a warning. The irrigation ditches, when they had water, glinted hard and bright under a punishing sun. When they didn't, they lay cracked and dull, like old scars across the earth. That year the drought had set its teeth in deep. I had just come back from the service not long before, thin and serious and still trying to remember how to be ordinary. The town welcomed me the way small towns do, with handshakes that lingered half a second too long and nods that carried both pride and expectation. I was our boy again. I took a job teaching 8th grade English at the same low-slung school where I'd once been sent to the principal's office for carving my initials into a desk. The classroom smelled of chalk dust and sun-warmed linoleum. Ceiling fans hummed lazily overhead, stirring hot air more than cooling it. I remember stacks of dog-eared paperbacks balanced on my desk, their covers curling from years of use. The kids' names came back to me like old songs: Garcias, Whitfields, Nguyen's, all of them sun-browned and restless, their fathers out in the fields before dawn. And in the middle of town, just off Main Street with its faded feed store sign and the diner that closed at 3, stood the public library. It wasn't much to look at. A squat brick building with ivy that had given up trying to climb in the heat. The oak shelves inside were worn smooth where hands had reached for decades. The place had a particular smell: paper, furniture polish, and a faint sweetness from the old carpet that had soaked up every summer since 1938. When you pushed open the door, a little bell chimed, polite and hopeful. Mrs. Ellison ran it. She had iron-gray hair pinned tight and a way of peering over her glasses that made you feel both inspected and forgiven. She'd been there since before I'd learned to read. As a boy, I used to sit cross-legged in the cool patch beneath the front window while the afternoon sun turned the dust motes into gold. I think I loved that building before I knew what love was. The trouble started quietly, the way most serious trouble does. The drought worsened. Wells dropped lower. Farmers met in clusters outside the co-op, hats pushed back, voices tight. The town council began talking about reallocation and future-proofing. There were plans to expand irrigation infrastructure, to invest in new pumps and channels. All sensible things. Necessary things. Money had to come from somewhere. I first heard about it from Mrs. Ellison on a Tuesday afternoon. I had stopped in after school, a stack of essays under my arm and sweat dampening the back of my collar. The ceiling fan above the circulation desk squeaked with every rotation. "They've asked for next year's budget projections," she said, keeping her voice low though we were alone. "And they've used the word non-essential." Non-essential. She said it like it tasted bitter. I tried to laugh it off. "They wouldn't close the library," I told her. "Not this one." But a week later, I noticed a gap on the shelf where a few titles used to sit. Books I assigned sometimes. Books that made certain parents uneasy. A novel about civil rights. A collection of essays questioning the war. A slim volume of poetry that spoke plainly about loneliness and doubt. "Rotated out," Mrs. Ellison said when I asked. Her eyes didn't meet mine. Soon there were more gaps. No announcement. No list. Just absences. In class, I began to feel it. A girl named Teresa asked me why she couldn't find the book her older brother had read the year before. A boy whose father served on the council smirked when we discussed freedom of speech, as if it were a luxury item we could no longer afford. Outside, the fields were turning the color of straw. The smell of dry earth hung in the air, thick and metallic. At night, when the sprinklers ticked in distant orchards, the sound felt fragile, like a promise that might not hold. Then the notice went up in the window of the post office, a town meeting to discuss budget adjustments. Everyone knew what that meant. The night of the meeting, the hall was already sweltering before sunset. Folding chairs scraped against the wooden floor. The screen door slapped shut again and again as people filtered in, bringing with them the scent of sweat and sun and dust. Men in pressed work shirts, women with tight smiles, children fanning themselves with folded programs from last year's harvest festival. I sat near the back at first. That was my instinct in those days: observe, measure, keep my head down. My job depended on the goodwill of the people in that room. In a small town, reputation is a currency you can't afford to squander. The council members took their places at the long table up front. Mr. Halvorsen, who had once coached my Little League team, cleared his throat and began reading from a typed sheet. His voice carried the careful cadence of someone trying to sound reasonable. Water was life. Agriculture was survival. Sacrifices had to be made. The library, while valued, served a limited practical function in times of crisis. There it was again, that word. Practical. I felt my hands tighten around the brim of my hat. Mrs. Ellison sat 3 rows ahead of me. Her back was straight as a fence post. When the floor opened for comments, there was a long silence. You could hear the ceiling fans whirring and the faint buzz of a fly against the windowpane. Finally, a rancher stood up and said what many were thinking: books don't grow crops. There were murmurs of agreement. Another voice, I didn't see who, added, kids can read at school. I remember looking at my own hands then. They were still young hands, strong from years of work and service. Hands that had learned to follow orders, to keep the peace. It would have been easy to let the moment pass. To trust that someone else would speak. To tell myself it wasn't my fight. But I thought of Teresa's question. Of those empty spaces on the shelf. Of the boyhood afternoons when that building had felt like the only cool place in a world that demanded so much certainty. Before I quite realized what I was doing, I was on my feet. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. I said I was a teacher. I said the library wasn't a luxury, it was an extension of the classroom. I said that in a town built on the land, we ought to understand that what you plant today determines what grows tomorrow. There were a few nods. More frowns. I spoke about the books that had quietly disappeared. I did not accuse, but I did not pretend either. I said that shielding our children from difficult ideas did not prepare them for a difficult world. The air in the hall seemed to thicken. I could feel eyes on me, some curious, some irritated, some already closed. Mr. Halvorsen's expression hardened in a way I had never seen before. When I finished, the silence felt heavier than before. Then someone coughed. A chair creaked. A woman I recognized as one of my students' mothers whispered something sharp to her neighbor. The discussion moved on, but something had shifted. I had stepped out of the safe, agreeable shape the town preferred for its young teacher. Afterward, outside under a sky bleached pale by heat even at night, a few people clapped me on the shoulder. Brave words, one man said, though he did not meet my eye. Others walked past without a nod. Mrs. Ellison found me by the steps. Thank you, she said simply. Her voice trembled just enough to make me understand the cost. In the weeks that followed, the drought deepened. So did the lines dividing the town. Parents who once lingered to chat after school now kept their conversations brief. At the diner, I felt pauses settle at my table when I entered. In the faculty lounge, the hum of the coffee pot seemed louder than usual. And then, one afternoon, I was called into the principal's office. The blinds were half drawn against the glare. Dust floated in the narrow bands of light. The ceiling fan ticked overhead. Mr. Jenkins folded his hands on the desk and regarded me with an expression that was not unkind, but not entirely friendly either. He spoke of community harmony. Of professional discretion. Of how young teachers sometimes mistook idealism for wisdom. On the corner of his desk lay a thin folder with my name written across it in blue ink. I watched his fountain pen roll slowly toward the edge, and I knew, with a clarity that made my chest ache, that whatever happened next would decide not just the fate of a small brick building on Main Street, but the kind of man I was going to be in a place where everyone was always watching. He let the silence stretch, the way men do when they hope you'll fill it with an apology. "I've had calls," he said at last. "Concerns. Some folks think you overstepped. They think it's not a teacher's place to stir things up." Stir things up. As if I'd taken a stick to a hornet's nest for the pleasure of it. I kept my eyes on that fountain pen. Black barrel, silver clip. It inched closer to the desk's edge with every faint vibration of the fan above us. "I spoke as a citizen," I said. My voice sounded older than I felt. "And as a teacher." Mr. Jenkins sighed. He'd known me since I was 12, since I'd broken a window playing catch too close to the gym. "You've got promise," he said. "But promise doesn't mean much if the board decides not to renew your contract come spring." There it was. Not a threat exactly. Just a fact placed carefully between us. Outside, a tractor groaned somewhere beyond the football field. I could almost see the dust lifting in its wake. "I won't ask you to change your mind," he continued. "But I will ask you to consider your future. This town takes care of its own. Long as its own don't embarrass it." Embarrass it. I nodded because there wasn't much else to do. The pen reached the edge and tipped, clattering softly onto the desk blotter instead of the floor. We both glanced at it. He picked it up, set it squarely in the center of the desk, and that was the end of the meeting. Word traveled fast after that. In a town like ours, it always did. I'd step into the feed store and feel conversations thin out. At church, the pew around me seemed to hold a little more space than it used to. Nothing overt. Just the quiet arithmetic of distance. Not everyone pulled away. Old Mr. Alvarez, who had lost 2 crops in 3 years, pressed a folded note into my hand one morning after Massachusetts. Inside, written in careful Spanish accented script, were the words, "My Rosa reads because of you. Do not stop." I kept that note in my wallet for decades. At school, the children watched more closely than the adults did. They sensed tension the way animals sense a change in weather. Teresa stayed after class one afternoon, twisting the strap of her book bag. "Are they really going to close it?" she asked. "I don't know," I told her. It was the honest answer. She nodded, serious as a judge. "My mama says books don't feed you. But I think maybe they do. Just different." I laughed softly at that, though it wasn't funny. "Maybe they do," I said. The council scheduled a final vote for late August, when the heat pressed hardest and tempers ran thin. In the meantime, more books disappeared. Some were boxed and stacked in the back room. Others, I later learned, were sent off to a storage facility in the next county. Officially, it was a matter of space and priorities. Unofficially, it was about discomfort. One evening I stopped by the library just before closing. The sky was the color of faded denim, and the air carried that metallic tang that sometimes comes before a storm, though none had come for months. The screen door slapped behind me, and the little bell chimed. Mrs. Ellison was alone at her desk, her shoulders slumped in a way I had never seen. "They've asked for my resignation," she said without preamble. The word seemed to hang there between us, heavier than any accusation. "They say it's unrelated," she added, with a brittle smile. "Budgetary efficiency. Fresh direction." I felt something in me harden then. Up to that point, I had told myself this was about ideas, about policy, about civic disagreement. But looking at her, at the woman who had guided my hand to my first library card, I understood it was about people. "I'm sorry," I said, and the phrase felt too small. She shook her head. "Don't be. I've had a long run." She glanced around at the shelves, at the worn oak and the scuffed carpet. "I just thought I'd see it through to the end." We stood there in the dimming light, listening to the fan hum and the distant whine of a pickup heading down Main. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a small brass key. "For the side door," she said. In case they change the locks before I've cleared my things. I held that key in my palm. It was warm from her hand. The night of the final vote, the hall was even more crowded than before. Heat radiated from the walls. Men fanned themselves with their hats. A baby cried somewhere near the back. The air smelled of dry cotton and impatience. I hadn't planned to speak again. Truly, I hadn't. I had said my piece. The lines were drawn. But when they read aloud the proposal, closure by October, staff termination effective immediately, selective retention of appropriate materials for classroom use, I felt that same tightening in my chest. I stood. This time there were fewer surprised looks. More weary ones. I spoke plainly. I did not quote philosophers or invoke grand ideals. I talked about afternoons in that building when the fields offered no shade. I talked about children who found, between those shelves, windows wider than any our town could frame. I spoke about drought, not just of water, but of imagination. If we close it, I said, we're telling our children that when times get hard, the first thing we give up is curiosity. That survival means narrowing, not growing. Someone muttered that I was naive. Another said we couldn't irrigate with novels. I nodded. No, I agreed. But you can irrigate a mind. It was a small line. Not clever. But it was true. When I sat down, my heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my throat. I knew, as surely as I had known in the principal's office, that whatever the outcome, my standing here would not be the same as before. The vote was not unanimous. That surprised me. 2 council members opposed the closure. It wasn't enough. By a margin of 3-2, the library was set to close. There was no dramatic outcry. No shouting. Just a low murmur that rippled through the room and then faded. People gathered their things. The screen door slapped again and again as they stepped back into the warm night. Outside, I stood under a sky streaked with thin clouds. For a moment, I felt foolish. Small. I had risked my position, strained friendships, and for what? The decision stood. Mrs. Ellison joined me on the steps. You did what you could, she said. It didn't feel like enough. In the weeks that followed, something unexpected happened. Not a miracle. Nothing so tidy. But a slow stirring. A group of parents, not many, but enough, began meeting in living rooms and on porches. They talked about fundraising, about volunteers, about keeping at least part of the collection accessible. Old Mr. Alvarez offered to donate a portion of his remaining crop, small as it was. A mechanic said he could fix the leaky roof if materials were covered. They did not credit me. They did not make speeches. They simply acted. By October, the town library as an official entity was gone. The sign came down. The budget line disappeared. Mrs. Ellison cleared her desk. But the building did not go dark. Through a patchwork of donations and stubbornness, it reopened as a community-run reading room. Fewer hours. No salary. Shelves a bit barer than before. Some of the troubling books never returned. That still sits with me. My contract was renewed that spring, though not without a formal letter about professional boundaries. I kept that letter too, tucked in a drawer as a reminder. Over time, the drought broke. Not all at once. A thin rain one November afternoon, the smell of wet dust rising so sweet and sharp it nearly made me weep. Then more, and more, until the ditches ran again and the fields turned something like green. People softened too. Or maybe I did. I married. Had children of my own. On Saturdays, I'd take them to that same brick building on Main, now run by volunteers with uneven handwriting on the checkout cards. I'd watch my son's fingers trace the spines. I'd see my daughter settle into that same cool patch beneath the front window where I had once sat. No one mentioned the meetings anymore. The tension faded into the sediment of town memory. Some of the men who had voted to close the library later donated boxes of books when their own children left for college. Life has a way of sanding down its sharper edges. Now, sitting here with the night air drifting across this porch and the faint tick of sprinklers in distant fields, I can admit something I couldn't then. I did not save the library. Not alone. Not completely. What I did was smaller than that. I stood up in a hot room and said that certain things matter even when they don't put food on the table. I accepted that being agreeable is not the same as being good. I learned that reputation can shrink and expand and survive. The building still stands. The shelves are different now. Computers hum where card catalogs once clicked. The oak is more worn than ever. But sometimes, when I walk past on a late afternoon, I push open the door just to hear that little bell chime. I breathe in the scent of paper and polish. I watch a child reach for a book no one has told them not to read. And I think about that young man in the overheated hall, heart pounding, unsure whether he was foolish or brave. It turns out you can be both. What stays with me isn't the vote count or the letter in my file. It's the look on Teresa's face the day she checked out a novel that made her ask hard questions. It's the weight of a brass key in my palm. It's the understanding that protecting something quiet and unprofitable can shape the course of your life as surely as any loud victory. The fields out there still depend on water. They always will. But I learned, that year, that a town depends just as much on the small, stubborn act of keeping a door open and a shelf within reach.